A can-do movie is a movie that just insists on being made. It doesn't care what kind of resources it lacks. It will get finished. And why do I like can-do movies? It's because I've made a couple of them myself.
So I'm still sticking along with my Stuart Gordon retrospective, and today I'm going to talk about Robot Jox from 1990. It was directed by Stuart Gordon, as all of the Stuart Gordon movies in this retrospective have been. I don't think there's anywhere he's restricted to a producer or writer or anything like that. It was written by this science fiction writer named Joe Haldeman. I'm not familiar with his writing, but some people might be. And it was produced by Albert Band, who's Charles Band's father. And Albert Band had been producing big movies, studio movies, since before Charles Band was born. So when you have this very important high dollar project, he wanted the best man for the job to take it on. And in this case, it was his father, Albert. And it was also produced by Empire Pictures. They had a studio in Rome that once belonged to Dino De Laurentiis. And they were using that for a significant part of Empire's existence until it came to an end. The budget on this movie was $6 to $10 million, and it's often pointed at as the reason Empire Pictures came to an end. It was by far the most expensive movie Empire had ever made, and it happened at a time when Empire was already having some financial problems, and this was the last straw, and it managed to push them over the edge so that Credit Lyonnais can just sneak in and swoop it away from them. Now, it's starring Gary Graham, who was in a lot of episodes of Alien Nation. He was kind of a regular on that show. Paul Koslow, who was a co-star with Charlton Heston in Omega Man. Not a great movie, but it is a great credit. And then, of course, Hilary Mason, who we saw in Dolls last week. Hilary Mason, the beloved British actress. At least I think she's British. I mean, most of her work was done in the UK, but I don't know for a fact that that's where she was born. And despite its budget of somewhere near $10 million, it only got $1.3 million from the box office. So you can see it was a very, very much a financial underperformer. Now, this movie is known for a whole lot of things other than being Robot Jox. Now, Stuart Gordon said it was based on the Transformers, and he specifically said it was based on the Transformers toy line and not the cartoon that had already been out for a couple of years when this was made. Stuart was probably too old for cartoons at that time. But he did reference it as being a live-action cartoon, although I would say it's more like a live-action anime. And I thought it was kind of cool because the first time I watched it, I was like, this is a live-action adaptation of an anime that doesn't exist. But if it did exist, it'd be a major Gundam ripoff. Now, I look at this movie and I think of it as like Rocky IV with robots. I also think of it as Top Gun, but it's on the ground. Ground gun? Bottom gun? Dirty gun? I don't know. And it's also Pacific Rim before Pacific Rim was a thing. When Pacific Rim came out in 2012, this movie got a lot of renewed interest, and it kind of gave it its own following at that point that seems to still be going strong today. And, you know, Stuart Gordon, like the guy, it really makes me happy to know that a movie of his got a second wind. And even though it was a flop in the theaters, it's alive in everybody's heart. And he had also said something about this being an adaptation of the Iliad, but as far as that's concerned, it is a very, very poor adaptation of the Iliad, if that's what he was going for. But the whole situation here, it's set in this post-apocalyptic world after World War III and society was demolished and had to rebuild from the ground up. And people said, you know what? There has to be a better way. There's got to be a way we can settle disputes without destroying the world. So they've developed like this format of having robot gladiators, giant robot gladiators, fight to settle disputes. And they call them robots, but I'm going to call them mechas most of the time because they have a pilot inside of them that's operating everything. So to me, that's not a robot. A robot's autonomous. These things are not autonomous. So they're vessels of some sort, ships on the ground. In this particular case where the movie's taking place, they're fighting for Alaska and all those rich natural resources that Alaska has. And one of the characters even says that there's maybe an element of revenge with the other side because they're angry that they lost Kampuchea. He calls it Kampuchea. I think it's pronounced Kampuchea, and most folks would probably know it as Cambodia, even though that's not really the name. So they don't just say America and Russia or whatever. They have these new nations that have rose up. One is called the Market. which is a not so subtle reference to capitalism, and that's the side that represents the United States. And then the other one's called the Confederation, and the Confederation represents the old USSR. Now, the guys in the mechas are called robot jocks. You know, they jockey robots. And this movie doesn't waste any time in giving us some cool stop motion animation. They let us see a big battle as soon as the movie starts. And it's just great David Allen stop motion effects. I'm not always one of those people that say David Allen's one of the great stop motion artists, but he's really good here. I think he gets a lot of love for Puppet Master, but I think this is probably his best work. Now, the Russian jock is a guy named Alexander, because I guess Alexander the Great. Alexander's a very Russian name, especially if you spell it with a K. And he keeps killing dudes. Like, he kills this dude in the preamble, and we find out that the reason he keeps killing dudes is because he knows about all the secret weapons that the American side comes up with for their mechs. And it turns out that he knows about all these secret weapons because there's a spy, so this also becomes a little bit of a story of trying to figure out who is the spy in our midst. So there's like this prelude fight when the movie first starts, and Alexander's killing this guy from the Western team at the end of the battle. Doesn't even have to kill him, but he does it anyway, almost like he hits him after the bell. And this all happens before he goes on to fight Rocky. I mean Achilles, not Rocky, Achilles. And of course, this sets up a big showdown that's going to happen later in the movie between Alexander and Maverick. Achilles! I mean Achilles! Now, this Achilles character, like the hero of the market team, or I'm going to call him the USA because that's what they are. He's played by this guy named Gary Graham. And I didn't really know much about Gary Graham, but when I watched this movie, like, I couldn't take my eyes off of him because he's like this proto Billy Bob Thornton. Last week I had a proto Sean Astin. This week I got a proto Billy Bob Thornton. We see a lot of people doing karate practice. Like, they're in this dojo doing their karate thing with pads and stuff on. And the first thing I got to ask is, if this is a world where your disputes are settled with giant robots, why do you want your robot jocks learning karate? I think that that's like saying, you know, we've got a tank for you, but before you use that tank, we want you to have some boxing lessons. To me, it just doesn't go well together. I think their time would be better spent if they just practiced on the whole robot piloting thing instead of the kung fu. But when our guy Achilles is doing karate, we hear that he's doing it against a group of people they call tubers. And they call them tubers because they're test tube babies that were sort of genetically engineered to be the perfect robot jocks. And there's a whole lot of I don't know, maybe Blade Runner here, where the naturally born humans are sort of not a big fan of the tubers, as they call them. But they're not tubers like a potato or a carrot. It's Tubers, like a YouTuber. And the tubers were created by the character who's being played by Hillary Mason. So you get a lot of fun of her really loving and caring about her tubers when nobody else does. Now, Jeffrey Combs is in this movie, and he shows up pretty high in the credits, but then when you watch the movie, if you're like me, it's a little disappointing because he plays this really minor character that's just like a yokel in the crowd making comments, kind of like Rob Schneider in The Waterboy, just there making commentary on what's going on. Why do people keep wasting Jeffrey Combs? And we got this character named Tex Conway, and he is very clearly, obviously, in no subtlety whatsoever, a riff or a ripoff or a remake of the Slim Pickens character from Dr. Strangelove. I mean, it's so transparent what they're trying to do with this guy, but he's enjoyable. I kind of like the way the actor plays it. And I also thought maybe there's just a touch of something from Ender's Game, because this is the only guy, I guess, who won 10 battles in a row and got to retire, and he's sort of a mentor for Achilles, so he's kind of like that Maori guy that came along to help Ender in Ender's Game. And we also got a character named Athena. She's one of the tubers. She's not a regular person. She's a genetic experiment. And she seems to be the only woman other than the elderly Hillary Mason that exists in this whole universe. So I'm pretty sure she's working overtime. But they have the first big fight between Alexander and Achilles, and this is going to be Achilles' 10th match. You know, he wins this and he joins Tex there. Tex Conway is one of the 10-time winners, one of the greatest of all time. Tex even takes him under his wing, calls him son, that sort of thing. And when the fight's going on, when we're watching it, it looks like Achilles is really kicking Major Bolt. But then Alexander cheats, and he shoots like this big rocket hand at the crowd, at the spectators, and they're all going to die. So Achilles sacrifices the match in order to jump in front of that and save the crowd. But he still ends up falling down on it and damaging most of the crowd, so maybe he should have just won the battle. I don't know. The guy's got a conscience, the guy's got morals. I gotta appreciate that. But because of the cheating and the heroic behavior, the referees, which has got to be a wonderfully powerful job to have in this world, being the referee of the robot jocks battles, but the referees have a little conference and decide to call it a no contest. There's no winner, there's no loser, they're going to have to repeat it. But Achilles thinks it's his 10th fight so he can retire, but because it was a no contest, people keep telling him, no, you've only got 9. So we got a little internal conflict, like every time I try to get out, they pull me back in. But this does set up a big blow-off match, and that's, we know that's going to be the climax of the movie when that happens. And like I said, they've been trying to figure out who this traitor is in their midst, and it's kind of revealed somewhat abruptly without any foreshadowing or giving us any real clues to add up to it. But it's revealed that it's Tex Conway, like the greatest robo-jock that the Americans had ever had, this legend. And I gotta be honest, I think that the story was pretty poor in how they handled him. They never reveal any kind of motivation for him to want to be a traitor. It just happens. Once he's discovered and found out, I mean, you should never say that's a hilarious way for somebody to off themselves. But he runs and just jumps down an elevator shaft and falls, and it's seriously like Bugs Bunny level, the way he takes care of himself there. You just got to see it to fully appreciate it, but it's another thing that's kind of jarring, but in a good way, and it really says Stuart Gordon to me. One of my biggest complaints about the last movie, Dolls, is that it didn't feel like Stuart Gordon, but this ridiculous Wile E. Coyote death scene absolutely feels like Stuart Gordon saying something. It's kind of crazy, it's off the wall, it's honestly like beautiful absurdity. So when it's time for the big blow-off match, Achilles refuses the call. He says, I'm not going to fight. I've done my time. I'm tired of all this. Count me out. So they get Athena, the one woman in the whole universe here. They get her to fight, which is taking a real big risk because, if she loses and dies, you don't have anything to turn to. Smurfette. She's the Smurfette. But then again, Achilles, because he's a total head case, the guy's wishy-washy up and down. He doesn't know if he wants to live or die, basically. So he changes his mind and he says, yeah, never mind, I am back into the match. But Athena, she's all stoked about it and she doesn't want him to be back. So Athena does a little kung fu fighting with him in his bedroom, gets a little seductive with him at one point, ends up locking him up, making him a prisoner at his own quarters. And that leads to this really fun, really incredible escape involving a flying car. He gets on his computer that looks totally like a Commodore 64, not something we'd have in the future. And he just uses 8-bit graphics or maybe 1-bit graphics. I mean, these things are seriously Pong level. And he remote controls a car, a flying car, to come and just crash into his room. And then he climbs into the car and uses that to escape. I love that escape. I love the flying car. The flying car kind of reminds me a little bit of Time Cop. Now, even when Achilles is expected to be the guy that's fighting, Athena puts on her helmet, her flight suit, whatever, so nobody can tell who she is, and then somebody starts to recognize her, and she karate kicks her way onto the robot that she's going to be jockeying. And I guess that backs up my theory that there was no good reason to teach these people karate, because if she hadn't taken karate, she couldn't have karate kicked her way on board. They created their own monster. Now, Athena's not bad. She gets off to a pretty good start against Alexander here. And she has this secret weapon that just flashes bright light, blinds him. You get it? The lady flashed him. It looks like he's on the ropes, but then there's a turn of events and he actually knocks Athena down on her sprockets. It's clear the fight's over. The referees have declared Alexander the winner, but he's not satisfied. He wants to keep going, and his plan is to kill this tuber who's in that other ship. As far as I know, he might even think it's Achilles at that point. I don't know if he knows who he's facing, but he wants to keep punching after the bell. But Achilles wouldn't be a hero of our story if he didn't show up and save the day. He goes in there, manages to get Athena. There's a broken arm where Athena ripped off an arm that has a missile attachment to it. So Achilles picks that up and just blasts it right at Alexander there and gets him enough time to get Athena out of the mech suit, and he gets into the mech suit, and now we're going to have our big battle. And this is a cool big battle because, we get some fighting in the arena, but then something I didn't even know these mechas were capable of. There was no groundwork laid down that this might happen, but suddenly they're flying in space. And when they're flying in space and having their space battle, it's kind of crazy. I mean, this feels very anime. But the graphics seem so different from everything else we've watched. They're like a little cleaner. It kind of feels like you're watching a used car commercial where they say, our deals are out of this world or something like that. But I really have fun with it. And I thought maybe the whole battle would be in space. But after a little skirmish up outside of the atmosphere, they come back down and land in a desert. And then they have some desert fighting. I also forgot to mention that one of the best parts of this Russian bot is that he kind of has a special weapon that I wasn't expecting, but boy, does it feel like something Stuart Gordon came up with. It's a crotch saw. Like a chainsaw comes out of his crotch, and there's no mistake what it's supposed to look like. But this desert battle with the mech suits, these dudes are so resilient and they refuse to give up. They both basically trash their mech suits because neither one will yield in this fight. And it devolves into a man versus man, good old-fashioned junk fight. Like they're using wreckage from the, from both of the mechs, and they're swinging like pipes and bars, and it's pretty cool. It's starting to feel real Mad Max at that point. But as the junk fight goes on, it gets to a point where it looks like Achilles could just bash Alexander in the head and this whole thing would be over with. But he pauses for a moment, and he has, like the Grinch's heart grew 3 sizes that day. He throws away his weapon. And he just makes eye contact with Alexander, who has this big stone he wants to bash his head in. And he basically gives us that moment where he says, if he can change, and I can change, we all can change. Like Rocky IV. And our movie ends with a little fist bump and a thumbs up, and everybody's friends again. Now, Stuart Gordon did sell this as a sci-fi version of the Iliad. And bless his heart, as they say in the South. Bless his heart. I guess he tried, but I'm starting to think he may have never actually read the Iliad. Like he knows that the Iliad is about Achilles and that's the end of the story because he has a character named Achilles. But yeah, he really misses the rest by a long shot. And like I said, this movie got a lot of renewed interest after Pacific Rim came out. It got a whole lot of look backs at it around 2012, and they wrote nice entries in like the Encyclopedia of Sci-Fi and some retrospective reviews that said, hey, you know what? This actually should have been appreciated in its own time instead of being largely ignored. And it's kind of cool when people look back with the tincture of time and see something differently. I mean, that's basically the story of The Thing, even though it happened much more quickly for Carpenter. And if you want to watch the movie, you can watch it free with ads on YouTube. I think it's also on Tubi, several other streaming services. It's not hard to see Robot Jox, so it's a fun one to check out. And if you really demand your high-definition Robot Jox, there is a Blu-ray that Shout Factory put out in 2015. I'm sure it's out of print, but there are probably copies around there you could scrounge up. So the high points on this movie. Definitely the David Allen stop motion. Like I said before, this has to be the best work of his career. A lot of times I actually think it's closer to not good than good, but here it's great. I mean, this movie is not the feature that it is without his stop motion work. Very enjoyable. And I really like proto Billy Bob Thornton. Not just because he looks like Billy Bob Thornton, talks a little bit like Billy Bob Thornton, but he really gets into this role. He's playing it like it's everything in the world to him. And that's sometimes what you need in a movie like this to really enjoy it, is to have a little juxtaposition of the good versus the bad and that sort of thing. So my hat's off to proto Billy Bob Thornton. Gary Graham, I think is his name. And then the robot designs are wonderful. I think David Allen also did the robot designs, but I apologize to whoever did it if I'm incorrect. But yeah, they look great. I mean, they look really like something that would come out several years later. They don't look like 1989 robots that were designed, or mech suits, you know what I'm saying. Of course, there's some downside to this movie. It has its warts, and the biggest one to me is that there's basically only 2 mech suits. There's 2 robots that get jocked, and I figure that their budget was already through the roof, so they couldn't afford to do more than 2. But it'd be nice to see this world like imagine Robot Bloodsport, where we get to see other fights going on while people are commenting and they're waiting for the big fight, and you can have some other side tragedies go on. It would really rock your world to see a whole bunch of these big mechas doing their thing, because what we do see is quite honestly fabulous. Athena's casting, I felt like the actor who played Athena, I think she fell pretty flat. She wasn't very convincing. She was like Miami Connection level acting, in my opinion. No, my apologies to her family if they're watching, which they're not. But I didn't like her, the actress, not the character. And then the karate dojo. You know, suspension of disbelief is important when you're watching a movie about giant fighting robots in the future. The dojo scene was just because, hey, Martial arts is kind of a thing people like right now. Let's shoehorn it in. But these actors clearly don't know martial arts. Like, they are not doing good karate in the karate dojo. And the karate dojo ends up making things worse instead of better. I could have done without that whole part. Give me something else. Give me playing volleyball on the beach. So the final word, this movie has great visuals that were way ahead of its time. I mean, this movie, of course, the film quality, there's some things around the edges that show you it's 1990. Actually, when Empire made movies in 1990, it showed it was 1984, but that's a conversation for another day. But the designs of the robots, the things that they're doing with those, I mean, those could be 2006. Those could be 2012. They're really good designs, very forward thinking, way better than what you'd see in like the Transformers animated series. But honestly, the plot isn't that great. The writing is really lackluster, and that's a drawback because I'm a very story-driven person. So at the end of the day, I'm going to give it 3 out of 5 Ed Woods.